author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we're going to be talking Department of Education, deep state, the upcoming Trump administration, and a whole lot more. One of the biggest announcements out of the nascent Trump administration is that the Department of Education is on its last legs and may soon be out the back door. Now, what does that mean for education in America? What does it mean for economics? Well, we're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's economics guru, Mr. Andrew Moran. Thanks for being here, Andrew.
Thank you for having me. It's been a while.
It has. Well, we've had, what was in the way? Well, there's an election. We got that out of the way, though.
The World Series.
The World Series, that was an important thing. I mean, that football that they keep throwing. I'm kidding, of course. But yes, economics. Let's talk about the election very briefly. I think everybody was surprised to find that much like every other election in recent history, it was all about the economy. So, certain people, let's be fair, certain people were surprised to find that out, namely those that thought Kamala Harris would win on the back of the current economy. What's your take on that?
Well, I looked at the exit polling that night. It all came out from NBC News to CNN, and they all showed the exact same thing. The number one issue, for the most part, was the economy, and number two, they all said the same thing. My financial situation is worse than it was 4 years ago, even during the height of the coronavirus pandemic. So it was still the economy, stupid, and it should be very interesting over the next 4 years if Trump can really turn things around. Because he said, for example, he's going to slash energy prices in half. So gasoline is now going to cost you, a buck or two. Less than $2 at the pump. So it should be very fascinating to watch because you have to balance between supply-demand dynamics, regulations, and just, government spending, which that's one thing I'm definitely skeptical that's not going to be touched.
Yes, we'll see how that goes out. I mean, that's a big economic promise there, is being able to cut government spending. And as you've pointed out many times on this show and in your articles, your superb economics coverage on pages of LibertyNation.com, that most of the spending is not a discretionary spend anyway. So there's almost, unless there's major legislative shift, there's really no way to cut 2/3 of the spending anyway. So any savings will have to come from that remaining third. But we shall see. Now, it seems to me that Donald Trump's ready to take a weed whacker to certain departments, much in the fashion of Argentina's Javier Milei, who decided to cut most of the government departments down, and apparently the country's still working. But the one I specifically want to talk about, Andrew, is the Department of Education. Now, there's a huge amount of pearl clutching across the Fourth Estate, legacy media, and social media to some degree, although less so on social media. And this is because people seem to be under the idea that education in America won't exist without the Department of Education. Care to educate me on that a little bit?
Oh, boy. So, the United States did not have a Department of Education until 1979 under Jimmy Carter. The United States before then was ranked one of the top countries in the world when it came to education. Why? Because there was such a focus on the basics of reading, writing, math. Today, the United States is one of the worst of the OECD countries, despite spending virtually higher than all OECD countries. So let's look at some of the numbers, for example. Our great Kelly Ballard, she's crunched the numbers for LibertyNation.com, and she looked at the ranking systems of OECD countries using ISA, the Program of International Standard Assessment. And the numbers are horrible. So in math, the U.S. ranked 28th out of 37 OECD member countries. In science, the U.S. ranked 12th out of 37. And the public also doesn't hold a positive view either. I think Pew Research, they did a study this past spring, and they said that, people think two-thirds of the people think the U.S. education system is average or below average. And this is despite the government spending $1 trillion a year on K-12 schools, and which is about $17,000 per pupil. You look at the number of OECD averages, the average is about $10,000. So the U.S. is spending more than South Korea, spending more than Canada, spending more than most of Europe, and it's still it's producing putrid results. So where's all this money going to? Guess what? Administrators.
I mean, that seems to be the overarching issue with it. That there's a heavy batch of administration that's creating a very much top-down approach. And, when Donald Trump announced this earlier this week via a video, because, of course, that he put out on social media, because it's Donald Trump, that's how he's going to do things. The first thing that popped into my mind, and you might be familiar with this, but have you heard of the Needham question? Needham. Okay, so there was a professor, a British professor, decades ago, 1930s, and Joseph Needham, and he went to China, and he discovered all these. He started digging into the history of invention. Now, China used to be one of the most inventive countries in the world. I mean, pretty much everything that shaped the modern world came from China, but then it stopped. It completely stopped dead, and they didn't invent anything, and they still don't really invent anything. Sure, there's some improvements here and there. A lot of people question where that intellectual property might come from, but they stopped being an inventive country, and this became the Needham question. Why did they stop? And for me, the most convincing answer is that there was bureaucracy from the Mandarins, the Chinese Mandarins, across all levels of society. So if somebody wanted to try something new or wanted to head out on an adventure, perhaps, to go and find new lands, they had to go through this bureaucratic hierarchy. Now, everything had to be administered the same, and that was how the Mandarin system worked. So rather than somebody sticking their head out, as the saying goes, it's the nail that sticks out that gets hit with the hammer. These people kept their heads down and just denied everything. And so nothing new or inventive was allowed to happen. Now, let me pull that back to the Department of Education. America is, what do they call it, 50 petri dishes of democracy. But it's also 50 petri dishes of education. And so when things are left to the states, sure, there's certain things that, parents would expect and society would expect schools to teach, as you pointed out, reading, writing, math. But when everything is from a top-down bureaucratic structure, that means that there's very little innovation in terms of education. And I think that's why education has suffered since the inception of the Department of Education. What's your thought on that?
Okay, so there's three things I want to touch upon here. Okay, so you talk about the Needham question. That reminded me of a book by Michio Kaku called Physics of the Impossible. And he delved into a chapter exactly about this, about how China, how they were a really scientifically advanced country, and then they traveled west to Europe, and they saw that, then they saw the Middle Ages of, they were still practicing, religion, and they were still stuck in the doldrums of a lack of scientific advancement. And they said, what's going on here? How come we have all this advancement, but they don't? And then they traveled back to Asia, and they just isolated themselves, and they embraced the same practices as Western Europe of not focusing on science. Number two, you talked about the top-down approach. You see the numbers, and they're very fascinating, because if you look at the numbers, you see student enrollment is actually on the decline. You see the number of new teachers joining the workforce, pretty much flat. And then you see administrators just rocketing out of nowhere. I think the last time I saw was about 81% over the last 20 years. Now, one of the reasons why I'm skeptical that this is going to happen, because since I was a kid, I'm 36, when I watched the Bush...
You're still a kid.
When I watched the 2000 election when I was, I think, about 12 years old, Bush ran on abolishing the Department of Education. And what happened during his administration? You got no child left behind. And that was just one of the initiation to the lackluster education system. Now, onto the states thing. You look at this, there was a great report, a ranking system last year by the U.S. News and World Report, and it ranked Florida as the top state for education. And why is that? Because Ron DeSantis, he took all the wokeness out of the classrooms, and he put an emphasis back on reading, writing, and math. I'll use a personal anecdote. Here in Canada, we have a conservative government of Ontario, and they overhauled the education system by putting a focus on reading, writing, and math, and incorporating things like coding and data analysis for even first graders. My kids are on the public system, and despite my grievances with the whole government education, I've been pleased with what they have been learning so far. I was so worried that they were going to start learning about 2S LGBTQIAP+ plus nonsense, but so far it's been just focused on the basics of reading, writing, and math, and they've excelled so far. if I may say. They've been doing very well. Kudos to them.
Well, your kids are the super bright little twins, so they're amazing. And we know they'll excel in anything with those two. So, yeah, it seems to me that the more devolved the power is from a central thing, and that's probably true with almost every department. I mean, we've seen that the decision on abortion has gone back to the states. And despite the screeching and the thrust of really the Kamala Harris failed campaign to focus on a national system of that, it seems that people are happy that decisions are with the state. I mean, there were 8 abortion initiatives on the ballot. I think 7 passed. 10, and 7 passed. So people enjoy the freedom to make their choice on the decisions that matter to them. In terms of voting for certain measures. And if education is devolved back to the states, I can't see that as being something that is restrictive anymore. And I think we'll see a lot more experiments coming out for that. Now, we're going to be back with Andrew discussing the wider potential Trump economy after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Andrew back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue to be joined by economics guru and editor, Andrew Moran. Hi, Andrew. Thanks for coming back.
Hello again.
So, with Trump's second term in office fast approaching, it seems that the biggest battle is going to be with the federal, one of the biggest battles. Of course, there are many battles about to be fought in this particular political war. But one of the biggest and most significant will be in the Federal Reserve. What's happening there?
Oh boy! I mean, get ready for some popcorn entertainment. I know everyone knows monetary policy is boring and that is just boring, but this is going to be really fascinating stuff to watch over the next 2 years. So, the Federal Reserve, they recently cut interest rates. They had their usual post-meeting press conference, and Jerome Powell was asked point blank, "If Trump asks you to resign, will you?" He simply said, "Nope." And then somebody asked, what if Trump wants to fire you? And then Jerome Powell says, not permitted under the law. And now we're learning that the Wall Street Journal, they recently had an article, and they found in 2018, Jerome Powell was ready to take Donald Trump to court if Donald Trump wanted to actually follow through and firing him back before the pandemic. So this is now turning litigious, or actually potentially litigious if Trump wants to, follow through on the completely kibosh on Jerome Powell and imposing somebody else he wants.
So what will that mean? I mean, we know that Jerome Powell's term, I think it expires in 2016. Anyway. Sorry, that's what I mean, 2016. Sorry, my time machine. I know. It's 2016. It was like yesterday, right? I mean, you had, Donald Trump heading for the White House? Nothing's changed, right? That's all the same. So, 2026, his term expires. Now, it seems to me that essentially Donald Trump wants to get as much done possible in the first 2 years because come the midterms, Democrats have an inbuilt advantage in much the same way that Republicans did this term round for the Senate. So there's a better than average chance at present that Democrats retake the Senate in 2026, which will essentially stymie many of the plans that he wants to achieve. So he can't do anything. It seems he can't do anything about Jerome Powell. It seems he has to get everything done within the next 2 years. So is Donald Trump looking at workarounds to, essentially shadow the Federal Reserve in terms of policy?
That's a really interesting word you just used, shadow. So there's a man, he's a billionaire, his name's Scott Bessent, and he spoke to Barron's magazine recently, and he put together the idea of having a shadow Federal Reserve chair. Now, this idea is that Donald Trump, he would nominate a Jerome Powell successor as soon as he enters the Oval Office. Thereby, everyone focuses mainly on what this incoming chair would say, as opposed to what Jerome Powell would do over the next 2 years. So that is quite a coincidence as you're using the word shadow. Now, when it comes to Jerome Powell, he's slashing interest rates. If you look at the summary of economic projections and all the commentary coming from both Jerome Powell and his colleagues, They're lowering interest rates. That is the objective right now. And they said that if the labor market suddenly weakens out of nowhere, then they're going to be more aggressive in cutting interest rates. So the Fed is lowering interest rates. The Fed is doing exactly what Donald Trump would want to happen. And now, considering there's a lag effect in monetary policy, these rate cuts, despite the grievances by Trump and his allies, it's perfect timing, because by the time he enters the Oval Office, the lag effect is usually between 4 and maybe 24 months, though there's debate on that, which you can read at LibertyNation.com, of course. But overall, this unwinding of restrictive monetary policy is going to benefit the Trump administration when he in the early years of the second term.
Yeah, I think that's it's going to. Yeah, it looks like it will sort of catch him on the upswing, combined with the other things that he's going to do. That he says that he's going to do, such as cutting gas prices in half, things like that. I think that will essentially have a cumulative positive impact all around. Your thoughts?
There's a but, though. There is a but.
Sure.
So Powell was asked about how a Trump presidency would impact monetary policy. So he said in the near term, the election is not going to affect the Fed's economic outlook. There's a but to that. He said that, but if, let's say, the administration's policies of tariffs were to create the expected inflationary effect, then the Fed may have to respond by either hitting the pause button on rate cuts or perhaps even imposing rate hikes. Now, Jerome Powell, he said that it's very likely that the Fed's going to start raising rates, but all the market watchers and economists say that is a possibility if the aggressive tariff introductions by the second Trump term will lead to price pressures, though that, of course, is a broader conversation, which we touched upon a little bit.
We'd actually discussed what we were going to discuss before recording this, and we thought, should we talk about tariffs? And we thought, that could be that's a bit too big of a topic for a half-hour, 40-minute show. But keep your eyes peeled on LibertyNation.com, and we will have some fun back and forths on the tariff conundrum there for you. Andrew, one more question. We've seen, actually, briefly on tariffs, we have seen certain areas of the market move towards onshoring already, haven't we? Now, that's obviously not going to be the whole picture for tariffs, but things are starting to happen in the economy now already in anticipation. So it's essentially they're trying to future-proof themselves. Is that about right?
Okay, so, we can go into history of it in the last few years, but I'll go to the most recent news story, and that came from Steve Madden. Now, Steve Madden is a $3 billion shoe company. They had a recent earnings results phone call, and the CEO, he said, you know what, in preparation of these tariffs, we're going to start trimming our sourcing to China by 75%, or sorry, 2/3 by next year. So a lot of that sourcing is going to either go back to the United States or other regional countries. And that's been the trend since the pandemic, when other countries wanted to diversify their supply chains.
Well, I think that's something that everybody really misses is if you have a globalized supply chain, you're subject to global issues. And yes, you can get things cheaper, but there's also that risk that you're not going to get these things at all, or you're going to be held hostage over them. And we've seen that with most specifically medicines not being made in the United States, which is a huge national security issue. But we will continue this conversation on tariffs on the page at LibertyNation.com. Andrew Moran, I really appreciate you being here. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you, sir.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
It seems government agencies have been running amok, much as Donald Trump suggested during his now successful campaign. What does this mean for the bureaucratic state going forward under a Donald Trump presidency, a second Donald Trump presidency? We're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's national security correspondent and a man who understands the machinations in and out greater than any Sir Humphrey that may be appointed, Mr. Dave Patterson. Thanks for being here, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
So, Dave, this has been in the week since Donald Trump won the election. It seems that jitters are forming inside the Beltway. What's your take on the situation?
Well, I think they are, because all the decisions are being made down in Mar-a-Lago. And, they're the standard pundits are not being asked about their opinion, and because they've been so successful in the past.
One of the greatest predictors of future actions is prior actions, which was what always struck me as funny when the legacy media in the run-up to the election were talking about Donald Trump's going to be a dictator, and he's going to do this and he's going to do that. And I speak to people who, I speak to everybody across the aisle, everywhere, whichever side of the aisle. And, when they say, Donald Trump, he's going to do all these, he's going to be a dictator, he's going to do all these things. And I said, what gives you that idea? And he says, well, it's obvious that he's going to do it. And I said, did he do it in the past? And they say, no, but that doesn't mean he won't do it in the future. And I think, well, and then I asked the question, what's the greatest indicator of future actions? And they say, well, they say nothing, to be honest. They start going off on a tangent to it. But yeah, the past is the best predictor of the future. So there's all these jitters taking place because people aren't, as you say, they aren't getting their opinion asked for, which they're used to doing even, and let's be very clear with this, during the first Trump administration, these people were consulted and many of them were put into positions. And it seems that that's not happening this time around.
No, that's true. And the reason is because I think that President Trump learned a valuable lesson. And that is that what people say is not always what they do. And no matter how much they try to ingratiate themselves and explain how valuable they are, the truth is that very few of them are really valuable to a point where they're better than everyone else. Mm. And I think that Trump realized that, and he put in people that he was that he gravitated toward emotionally, like, for example, General Mattis. That's a good example. And when General Mattis was chosen, I thought that was a good thing. And because he was very organized, he was one of the best battlefield commanders that we had. He did a terrific job. But what we ended up with was a CENTCOM on the Potomac. Mm. He brought with him everything that he knew, and that just did not really work in terms of the politics and how Washington works. So it was not a good fit after all. But I think that President Trump has realized that these kinds of things are true, and is going about things entirely differently, and is going at them much faster. I believe that this whole chessboard was set up quite a long time ago, and that now it's just looking at the things and refining the decisions.
Moving into the end game. I think it's pretty... So it seems to me that what we have now is there's a number of federal agencies and organizations that are expanding on the jitters thing, quite rightly worrying about what's going to happen to their organizational structures. And I think a case in point is the recent discovery, I believe it was Daily Wire that broke the story first, about a FEMA team leader who... Now, let's set the background on this. This is quite something interesting. During the campaign, Donald Trump made arguments for two things. He said, one, that FEMA was spending millions of dollars on illegal immigrant programs. And number two, he said that FEMA was not providing services to people in Republican areas. Now, he was lambasted through the press as a conspiracy theorist, and I believe the FEMA director went on the news and said, when he spreads this kind of misinformation, it causes us danger. Anyway, it turns out just a couple of weeks down the line that, of course, FEMA money was being spent on illegal immigrant programs, and that too, yes, Republicans were being actively avoided by FEMA. And this came out, there was an employee, she's now an ex-employee apparently, but she felt confident enough to put out on her organizational memos and to enter into the governmental systems and this is not quite an exact quote, but it's avoid homes with Trump Vance paraphernalia. And the people in her team were confident enough that this would not be an issue, that they entered that as a reason for not going to a particular house on the government database. Now, the FEMA director, is the director, she said that this person has now been dealt with and this does not represent our values. My question, Dave, is why did the people, the lady who's been fired, Marnie Washington, and the people within her team feel confident enough that this was not a gross violation of duty, that they're even confident enough to put it into a government system to enter it? It had a Trump-Vance flag on the system.
That's pretty simple. I mean, it's cultural. That is their culture. They are anti-conservative. They're anti-Republican. They're chosen for that. It is part of their very nature, so that when you fortify that notion in their mind, it's perfectly obvious. Of course we would do that. Why wouldn't we? Because they're the enemy. And what it does is it absolutely underpins this notion that within the bureaucracy, there is this community that is anti-Trump, and they will do whatever is necessary to ensure that Trump and his administration is not successful. It is what they live for. He calls it the deep state, and actually Hamilton called it the deep state. But it is. This is an undercurrent of people who are diametrically opposed to the will of the people of the United States, and they are perfectly happy to do everything they can to succeed because it's part of their culture.
I think it's fascinating that you use the word culture there, because if something is culturally inherent within a system or within an organization, then who is ultimately responsible? Well, that's the leadership of that organization, right? Because they inculcate the culture from the top down. And so, although the individual in question, the one who put out these orders, both in writing and verbally, to avoid houses with Trump-Vance paraphernalia, although she has been fired, it does nothing to address the fact that this was allowed to fester and foster within an organization that, let's be very, very clear, FEMA saves lives, right? And if they're picking and choosing winners or people that they'll deal with here, that could lead to a loss of life for people based on their politically charged culture. And so I'm wondering how many heads of these agencies will be given their walking papers once Donald Trump is inaugurated.
Well, I think to your point about saving lives, it's absolutely true. But I also see this as, more ubiquitously, they are supposed to reduce misery, because in catastrophes, people are in misery, and that's their job, to come in to do things that will decrease and reduce the misery of the people. And when you pick and choose who you're going to allow to be miserable and who you're not, then I think there's a serious, serious problem. It's a despicable attitude and a despicable behavior. But it is not surprising, because when you think about it, the rhetoric that was used against Trump, perfectly consistent with what FEMA's behavior was. But it's not just going to be this one supervisor who is going to be fired now, of course, because now you can sweep the place clean of all of these reprobates that have chosen politics over the public.
And that is something we'll continue discussing after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue to be joined by Liberty Nation's national security correspondent, Dave Patterson. Now, Dave, thanks for sticking with us. Earlier in the show, we were talking about these government agencies, federal agencies, that are likely to face, let's call it a root and branch reform, courtesy of incoming President Donald Trump. But I'd like to more sort of move into speaking about how Donald Trump is going to forcefully try and apply his mandate. Now, we've discussed this off camera about the mandate. So at time of recording, he has 312 electoral college votes. He has the popular vote. He has an increase in the Senate, which flipped to, will flip when everybody's on board, to Republican control. And although AP News hasn't called this at time of recording, there's other places have. He now has a majority in the House as well. So how do you think he's going to use that mandate moving forward?
Well, I think, first of all, he's going to be more intrusive into the congressional machinery than most presidents. And most presidents don't do that because they don't have the cachet to do it. But I think that Donald Trump believes he does. He has this notion, and one that I actually personally agree with, which is management by a single alternative. At any rate, I think that what Trump is going to do in terms of the bureaucracy is he is going to decide what it is that he wants to do. He's going to make it perfectly clear, and you should not get in his way. And I think that's perfectly acceptable for a bureaucracy that has been traditionally anti-Trump. And even in the first administration, it was clear that the tide was not with President Trump at the time, and there were all manner of people and never Trumpers and Russia, and all that kind of stuff that were distractions. But even with all those distractions, he got an enormous amount accomplished, and I think that he now knows that he is not going to be persuaded by distractions. And you let somebody else take care of that. You are focused on getting what you promised the people, and you're going to have energy independence again. You're going to close the border, and you've got two people now with Homan and Noam who will be on your side to do that. And they're both focused on the very same thing that you are, closing that border. And I think that Kristi Noem will also solve your FEMA problem for you by cleaning that house. And there will no longer be the mission of FEMA as diversity, equity, and inclusion. That is not an option, which is in their strategy.
Yeah, it is notable that even private corporations are now pulling back from the DEI mantra. Now, that actually started well before this 2024 election heated up, and it looks like it's because it's been affecting their performance and their bottom line. And maybe they do. Obviously, they have that responsibility to the shareholders. But we're seeing a lot of these. I don't want to call them structures, but maybe I will call them structures. But these edifices. That's a better way to look at it. So you've had the DEI, you've had the electric vehicle mandate. All of these things that have sort of grown in the last 6, 7, 8 years to become the pinnacles of, or the pillars which girded the Biden administration, the now outgoing Biden administration. And they seem to be crumbling, as edifices often do. And they seem to be crumbling, but not because of any pushback from a well-organized political right, because let's be clear, there isn't, and there hasn't been for a long time, a well-organized political right, except for perhaps Donald Trump's most recent campaign team, which is a bit of an oddity, which I'd love to get further into. But they're crumbling under their own weight. And so I don't think it's going to be a case that Donald Trump, if he chooses to, if his administration chooses to go in and start tearing these things down, because they appear to be crumbling by themselves. What's your take on that?
No, I think that's true. And of course, the reason they're crumbling by themselves is because they had no support from the citizenry of the United States, because these were things that were forced on the people by the, I hate this term, but because elite gives them some sort of cachet that they don't deserve. But the fact is that they come up with these ideas and they know they're better, and they're going to force them on the people because they know better than the people who elected them. And so that's where you get the electric vehicle mandate. The reason that all these things are crumbling is because they have no popular support. And if things are going to cost me money, then you better ask me and get my approval to support them. I mean, $7 billion and we have, or $1 billion and we have 7 charging stations. I mean, that's really exciting. But it's perfectly consistent with Harris's use of her money, where she's now broke. And so
her campaign,
yeah, right.
I'm sure individually she's doing absolutely
I
fine.
suspect that she'll probably become CEO of a Fortune 500 company. No, she won't. I'm kidding. They've got more sense than that.
just to clarify what you mentioned there, Dave, for anybody who didn't know, the Kamala Harris campaign spent over $1 billion to win the election, which is quite the sum. That and a lot of it, well, not a lot of it, but a certain percentage of it went on paying for these celebrity endorsements. Oprah Winfrey's Harpo Productions got $1 million, which, as far as I know, Oprah Winfrey's a billionaire and she doesn't need the money, and yet her company chose to take $1 million of this cash that's come in order to appear for Kamala Harris. And so there's actually a lot of talk about who else got paid to do an appearance, and yet it was all unsuccessful ultimately. And her campaign is reportedly in over $20 million of debt. And so there are vendors who are going to be waiting a long time for that money. I believe Donald Trump has very generously offered to figure out a way to pay those vendors off so they don't get negatively impacted by it. But sorry to interrupt. Please carry on with your
No, but all of these things are absolutely emblematic of the liberal mindset, where do what we say, don't do what we do, because what we do we can't at all justify, but we know that we're right when we tell you to do things. There's in Washington, D.C., I talk about this occasionally, but there are several forms of lying. One of the forms of lying is that you tell somebody something that is absolutely untrue, and we call that a real lie. Then you have people who talk to you and tell you things that, to the best of their knowledge, is true, but they aren't. And then you have the last, which is the most prevalent, and that is people who tell you things that they wish were true. And this is emblematic of liberals. They tell you things that they wish were true because they have a worldview that is totally inconsistent with reality.
You know what? I would say that expands across the political divide, because there's hopes, dreams, and unrealistic expectations on every side of the political compass there. But yeah, David, it really does seem to me that your points about do the air quotes elites thing here, it's almost like they're trying to create an intellectual hegemony, but they lack the basic. Let's be clear, it's either the intellect or the support to sustain such a hegemony, and I think that became very apparent in these last couple of weeks. Dave Patterson, thanks ever so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mark. Always fun to talk to you.
And that's all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to take a moment to thank our guests today, economics guru Andrew Moran and national security correspondent Dave Patterson. And of course, extend my thanks to you, the listeners, who tune in each and every week to make this thing possible. And remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation. And this presentation is no endorsement. Thanks for being here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.